Ladies and gentlemen, welcome back to the channel. On the morning of December 7, 1941, the serene skies over Pearl Harbor were shattered by the roar of Japanese warplanes. Within moments, battleships were ablaze, sailors scrambled for cover, and America's sense of invincibility was forever broken. President Franklin D. Roosevelt would famously call it a date which will live in infamy. But behind the drama of that day lies a deeper and more complex story. Why did Japan, half a world away, launch such a bold and devastating strike against the United States? And why did this attack, out of all the provocations in the years leading up to it, become the tipping point that drew America into the Second World War? The answers go far beyond military tactics or political rivalry. They reach into decades of tension, economic sanctions, imperial ambition, and strategic miscalculations on both sides. As we unravel the chain of events leading up to that fateful morning, we uncover not just the story of an attack, but the story of how two nations collided on a path to total war. In the years leading up to World War II, the United States maintained a firm stance of isolationism. Haunted by the devastating cost of World War I and disillusioned with European politics, most Americans wanted nothing to do with foreign entanglements. This sentiment shaped U.S. policy throughout the 1930s, with Congress passing a series of neutrality acts designed to keep the country out of another global conflict. Meanwhile, across the Pacific, Japan was charting a drastically different course. Driven by a desire for natural resources and imperial dominance, Japan began an aggressive campaign of expansion, starting with the invasion of Manchuria in 1931 and escalating with the brutal full-scale war against China in 1937. As Japanese forces pushed deeper into Asia, committing atrocities like the Nanjing Massacre, tensions with the United States grew steadily. Washington viewed Japan's actions as a threat to the balance of power in the Pacific and a violation of international norms. In response, the U.S. imposed a series of escalating economic sanctions, culminating in a crippling oil embargo in 1941 and the freezing of Japanese assets. Since Japan relied heavily on imported oil to fuel its military and industry, these actions were perceived not just as punitive, but as existential threats. Japan now faced a stark choice: retreat from its imperial ambitions or secure the resources it needed by force. The stage was set for confrontation, not by sudden aggression, but by a long and deliberate escalation of pressure, mistrust, and clashing worldviews. On the morning of December 7, 1941, as the sun rose over the Hawaiian island of Oahu, a calm Sunday turned into a nightmare. At exactly 7:55 a.m. local time, waves of Japanese aircraft descended on Pearl Harbor, launching one of the most devastating surprise attacks in American history. In a meticulously coordinated assault, over 350 Japanese planes, including bombers, torpedo planes, and fighters, targeted battleships, airfields, and naval facilities with brutal precision. Within minutes, chaos engulfed the harbor. The USS Arizona was hit by an armor-piercing bomb that detonated its forward ammunition magazine, causing a massive explosion that instantly killed over 1,100 men. Nearby, the USS Oklahoma capsized, trapping hundreds of sailors inside. In total, more than 2,400 Americans lost their lives that day, with another 1,000 wounded. Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, the architect of the Pearl Harbor attack, was no warmonger. He knew the risks of waking a sleeping giant. Yet he also understood that Japan's growing empire depended on access to natural resources like oil, rubber, and steel, resources increasingly cut off by the United States through embargoes and economic pressure. To Yamamoto and Japan's military leadership, war with the U.S. seemed inevitable. Their only hope, they believed, was to strike first, and hard, crippling American power in the Pacific so thoroughly that the U.S. would hesitate to retaliate with full force. Thus, the plan was born: a surprise aerial assault that would destroy battleships, sink carriers, wreck airfields, and paralyze America's ability to respond. But while the attack achieved tactical success, sinking or damaging 19 ships and destroying over 300 aircraft, it was strategically a profound failure. Japan had hoped that the sheer devastation would force the U.S. into a negotiated peace, preserving Japan's imperial ambitions. Instead, the opposite happened. Within 24 hours, America united in fury. Congress declared war with just one dissenting vote. Millions of young men enlisted. Factories that had been idle during the Great Depression roared to life. Roosevelt's famous address to Congress called it a date which will live in infamy, not just as a condemnation of the attack, but as a rallying cry for total war. Survivors' memories of that day are seared into American history, not just for the violence they endured, but for their courage amid the chaos. Some dove into burning waters to rescue comrades. Others fought fires and manned guns despite being wounded. The emotional gravity of those testimonies reveals the human cost of geopolitical gambles. Pearl Harbor was not just the beginning of World War II for the U.S. It was the moment when the war became truly global and when American isolationism gave way to total mobilization. What Yamamoto had feared most came true. Instead of weakening the United States, the attack forged its resolve, setting the stage for a long and brutal war that would eventually turn against Japan. The attack on Pearl Harbor shattered any illusions that America could remain detached from the world's escalating conflicts. Within hours of the bombing, news swept across the nation, leaving behind a stunned and grieving public. Radio broadcasts delivered grim updates, and newspaper headlines screamed of destruction and betrayal. What had been a nation divided by political differences, economic concerns, and deep-rooted isolationism suddenly transformed overnight. Public opinion, once cautious about joining another global war, hardened into a unanimous cry for justice and retribution. On December 8, 1941, President Franklin D. Roosevelt addressed Congress and the nation in a speech that would become one of the most iconic in American history. With a firm, resolute voice, he described December 7th as a date which will live in infamy. Roosevelt's speech wasn't just a condemnation of the attack, it was a declaration of unity, of purpose, and of unshakable resolve. The very next day, Congress voted to declare war on Japan, with only one dissenting vote, signaling near-total national agreement. Across cities and small towns, enlistment centers were flooded with volunteers. Americans rationed food, conserved fuel, bought war bonds, and prepared for a fight unlike any they had faced before. Germany and Italy's decision to declare war on the United States, just 4 days after the attack on Pearl Harbor, dramatically escalated the scope of the conflict. Though the United States had only formally declared war on Japan, Adolf Hitler, confident in the strength of his Axis alliance and emboldened by a series of early military victories, chose to bring America into the European war. It was a fateful choice. Up until that point, President Roosevelt had struggled to convince the American public and Congress to engage directly in the European theater, despite Nazi aggression and the growing threat to democratic nations abroad. But Hitler's declaration removed any ambiguity. The war was no longer a distant crisis. It was a global emergency that now demanded American might. This three-pronged war effort reshaped every facet of American life. It led to the full-scale mobilization of industry, the drafting of millions into military service, and the transformation of the U.S. into what Roosevelt called the arsenal of democracy. Factories once making cars now built tanks and planes. Women joined the workforce in unprecedented numbers, symbolized by the cultural icon Rosie the Riveter. Scientific research accelerated, eventually leading to the Manhattan Project. The war effort united Americans across political and regional lines with a singular mission: total victory. Internationally, America's entrance into both the Pacific and European fronts altered the balance of power. The Allies now had access to America's vast industrial capacity and manpower. Supplies and troops flowed to Britain, the Soviet Union, and later to the front lines of Africa, Europe, and the Pacific Islands. The war became a turning point in global history, not just because of the fighting, but because it catalyzed the rise of the United States as a true superpower. No longer would it remain a nation that retreated into isolation after conflict. Instead, America emerged from World War II as a central figure in shaping the post-war world, leading the creation of international institutions like the United Nations and assuming a new responsibility in maintaining global order. Thus, the aftermath of Pearl Harbor did more than launch a military response. It triggered a fundamental transformation in the United States' identity. A nation once wary of foreign entanglements had now become the backbone of a global alliance. And with this new role came a lasting legacy, one that would shape the rest of the 20th century and beyond. Japan's decision to attack Pearl Harbor was rooted in a combination of desperation, ambition, and grave miscalculation. By the early 1940s, Japan's economy and military ambitions were heavily dependent on imported resources, especially oil, rubber, and steel. The imperial government, driven by militaristic leadership and nationalistic ideology, had already begun aggressive expansion throughout East Asia, including the brutal invasion of Manchuria in 1931 and the full-scale war with China in 1937. These actions increasingly strained relations with Western powers, particularly the United States. When Japan moved into French Indochina in 1940-41, America responded with economic sanctions that hit Tokyo where it hurt most, an oil embargo and the freezing of Japanese assets. This threatened to cripple Japan's ability to maintain its military operations and sustain its empire. Facing the prospect of economic collapse or retreat, Japanese leaders saw war as the only path forward. Their strategy was bold but perilously flawed. Cripple the U.S. Pacific Fleet in a surprise attack, then quickly secure the resource-rich territories of Southeast Asia, like the Dutch East Indies and British Malaya, before the U.S. could respond effectively. Japanese leadership, particularly Admiral Yamamoto, knew that a prolonged war with the United States was unwinnable. But they gambled on the belief that America, shocked by a decisive early blow and unprepared for global war, would sue for peace rather than commit to a costly and distant conflict. This underestimation of American industrial strength, national will, and political unity would prove to be Japan's greatest mistake. The Japanese believed that a swift and decisive blow at Pearl Harbor would shock the United States into submission, or, at the very least, delay its entry into the Pacific long enough for Japan to secure vital resources across Southeast Asia. But they fundamentally misunderstood both the spirit of the American people and the nature of American power. Far from instilling fear or hesitation, the surprise attack ignited a fierce national response. Isolationism, which had dominated U.S. foreign policy since the trauma of World War I, disintegrated almost instantly. In its place surged a powerful wave of unity, outrage, and purpose. Millions of Americans, previously wary of involvement in foreign wars, now volunteered for military service. Factories that had been dormant or operating at low capacity roared to life, fueled by patriotic fervor and the promise of total war. The attack had not destroyed the Pacific Fleet entirely. Key assets like aircraft carriers were not in port that day, but it had awakened a sleeping industrial giant. The United States possessed vast natural resources, unmatched manufacturing potential, and a political system that, once aligned with the public will, could mobilize on a scale that Japan could never match. In trying to avoid confrontation, Japan ensured it. And worse, they did so on terms they could not control. Over the next 4 years, American forces would push across the Pacific island by island, backed by a home front that produced ships, tanks, and aircraft at an astonishing pace. Japan's high command, which had hoped for a quick diplomatic settlement, instead found itself locked in a long, grueling war of attrition it could not win. The consequences of Pearl Harbor extended far beyond military losses. It redrew the map of American identity and global ambition. The United States emerged from the ashes of the harbor not only as a combatant, but as a leader on the world stage, militarily, economically, and ideologically. The attack was meant to stop the U.S. from interfering in Asia. Instead, it marked the beginning of America's rise as a global superpower, and for Japan, the beginning of the end. The attack on Pearl Harbor did more than plunge the United States into World War II. It reshaped the trajectory of the entire 20th century. In the immediate aftermath, the U.S. launched one of the most rapid and massive military mobilizations in human history. Within months, factories across the nation had shifted from consumer goods to war production. Assembly lines that once built cars now turned out tanks and bombers. Women entered the workforce in unprecedented numbers, symbolized by the iconic figure of Rosie the Riveter, while rationing, war bonds, and patriotic media campaigns unified the home front behind a common cause. This mobilization wasn't just about numbers, it was about capacity and willpower. The United States' vast natural resources, technological innovation, and centralized coordination allowed it to outproduce and outlast its enemies. The nation became the arsenal of democracy, supplying not only its own troops, but also arming the Allies with the tools needed to resist Axis aggression. By the time American troops began arriving in North Africa and Europe in large numbers, the balance of power was already beginning to shift. Just as critically, Pearl Harbor ended the bitter divide in American public opinion. Before the attack, many Americans were adamantly opposed to joining another foreign war. But December 7, 1941, erased those divisions almost overnight. The bombing was not just an act of war, it was perceived as an act of treachery, and it fused a deeply personal sense of outrage with a broader moral clarity about the stakes of the conflict. Americans now saw World War II not just as a foreign fight, but as a battle for survival, for justice, and for the future of the free world. The aftermath of Pearl Harbor didn't just reshape the military landscape of World War II, it redefined America's very identity on the world stage. Before the attack, the United States had largely adhered to a policy of isolationism, reluctant to involve itself in global conflicts after the traumas of World War I. But Pearl Harbor shattered that illusion of distance. It made clear that oceans were no longer barriers, and that events in faraway lands could strike directly at American soil. That realization triggered not only a massive military response, but a profound psychological and ideological shift. As the U.S. threw its full weight behind the Allied cause, its industrial might became a critical advantage. American factories produced planes, tanks, ships, and ammunition on an unprecedented scale. This wasn't just manufacturing, it was a mobilization of society. Men enlisted by the millions, women filled the industrial workforce, and science and innovation were rapidly accelerated through programs like the Manhattan Project. America's economy became inseparable from the war effort, and in doing so, it emerged stronger, more unified, and more globally connected than ever before. In Europe, American troops were essential to the D-Day invasion, the liberation of France, and the final defeat of Nazi Germany. In the Pacific, the war took on a grueling attritional character, fought island by island in places like Guadalcanal, Iwo Jima, and Okinawa. These were battles of endurance, strategy, and raw human will. Each victory brought the U.S. closer to Japan, demonstrating not just tactical prowess, but a relentless commitment to total victory. But beyond the battlefield, the ideological turning point was even more enduring. Pearl Harbor catalyzed the transformation of the United States into a global superpower, not just in terms of military reach, but in diplomatic influence, economic dominance, and moral authority. No longer would the U.S. sit on the sidelines. From 1941 onward, it embraced a leadership role in shaping the post-war world, founding institutions like the United Nations, the International Monetary Fund, and NATO. This was a fundamental reimagining of America's place in the world, from a republic wary of foreign entanglements to a guardian of global order. The idea that the U.S. could project power for the sake of democracy, freedom, and peace became part of its national identity, a belief that, when necessary, the nation could rise from tragedy and mobilize its vast resources to shape history. In that sense, Pearl Harbor was not just an act of war. It was a catalyst for a new world order. Its legacy lives on, not only in remembrance, but in every moment the United States acts on the belief that it can, and must, lead in times of global crisis. The legacy of Pearl Harbor is not just a historical memory. It is a defining symbol of national trauma and transformation. The USS Arizona Memorial, rising above the submerged battleship, is more than a tribute to the 1,177 sailors who died aboard her. It's a physical embodiment of grief, sacrifice, and the enduring cost of unpreparedness. Visitors stand in hushed silence over the wreck, watching oil droplets, the black tears of the Arizona, still seeping from the ship's hull decades later. These slow, steady leaks serve as a haunting reminder that the past is never truly gone. It echoes forward, drop by drop. Each year, the commemoration of December 7th offers more than just a ceremony. It's a collective act of remembrance that keeps alive the lessons of history. As the number of living survivors dwindles, their testimonies become even more sacred, eyewitness accounts of chaos, courage, and loss in one of America's darkest hours. These commemorations are not just about honoring the dead, but about warning the living. Pearl Harbor has become synonymous with the phrase "never again," a phrase that shapes U.S. military doctrine, intelligence priorities, and foreign policy decisions. The psychological shift triggered by the attack on Pearl Harbor was profound and irreversible. Before December 7, 1941, a large portion of the American public embraced a deeply rooted belief in geographic isolation, a comforting notion that the vast Atlantic and Pacific Oceans were natural barriers, rendering the United States immune to the kinds of wars tearing through Europe and Asia. This mindset was reinforced by the traumatic memories of World War I, where the U.S. had intervened late and at great human cost, leading many Americans to adopt a staunchly non-interventionist stance throughout the 1920s and 1930s. Pearl Harbor shattered that illusion in a single morning. The idea that the U.S. homeland was untouchable was suddenly proven dangerously naive. Japanese bombers had reached American soil, striking not some distant outpost, but a critical naval base deep in the Pacific. It wasn't just a physical assault, it was a psychological rupture. If the U.S. could be attacked with such devastating surprise, it meant the old paradigm of Fortress America no longer applied. Safety could not be measured by miles or oceans anymore. It would have to be actively secured, constantly monitored, and globally defended. In response, the United States underwent a dramatic transformation in how it viewed and executed national security. The government moved quickly to ensure that a surprise attack of such magnitude could never happen again. This gave birth to a massive and permanent expansion of the military-industrial complex. The U.S. began stationing troops in key strategic locations around the globe, not merely for war, but for deterrence and early response. Naval bases were fortified and spread across the Pacific and Atlantic. Intelligence agencies like the Office of Strategic Services, precursor to the CIA, gained prominence, and technologies like radar and code-breaking became national priorities. The concept of forward defense became the cornerstone of U.S. military doctrine. Rather than waiting for threats to come to American shores, the strategy shifted toward confronting dangers as far away from the homeland as possible. This mindset would persist through the Cold War, manifesting in alliances like NATO, the policy of containment, and the establishment of a global network of military installations, all born in part from the psychological lessons of Pearl Harbor. Even today, the echoes of that trauma influence American foreign policy and security thinking. From 9/11 to cyber warfare threats, the notion that surprise can strike at any time still drives the insistence on preparedness, vigilance, and global reach. In short, Pearl Harbor didn't just change how America fought, it changed how America thought. The imagery of the granite memorial and the rusting steel of the USS Arizona beneath it carries layers of symbolism that go far beyond their physical presence. These are not merely relics from a past war. They are enduring, almost sacred elements of a living historical memory. The white marble structure floating above the sunken battleship creates a visual and emotional bridge between the past and the present. Visitors don't just see history, they feel it, standing over a graveyard where over 1,000 sailors remain entombed. The slow drip of oil still leaking from the wreck, referred to by some as the tears of the Arizona, is a haunting, ongoing reminder that the past is never truly buried. Calling these memorials silent sentinels underscores their role as vigilant guardians of national memory and caution. They do not speak, yet they communicate a powerful warning that complacency, delayed action, and the underestimation of foreign threats can have devastating consequences. The attack on Pearl Harbor wasn't simply a tactical failure, it was a failure of imagination, of readiness, and of political unity. The wreckage serves as a stark, immovable witness to what happens when a nation is caught off guard. The legacy of Pearl Harbor continues to inform the very core of how America organizes its defense and engages with the world. It's evident in how soldiers are trained, not just for battle, but for flexibility, resilience, and rapid response. It lives in the sophisticated and sprawling intelligence networks that seek to detect and prevent threats before they materialize. It is reflected in the strategic importance placed on international alliances, from NATO to bilateral defense treaties in the Pacific. These are not just diplomatic tools. They are expressions of a lesson learned in blood. Isolation is vulnerability. Moreover, Pearl Harbor fundamentally shaped the American philosophy of preparedness. The idea that peace is not a natural state, but something that must be actively preserved, took deep root in the national consciousness. It's a mindset that underpins the belief in deterrence, the need for continual technological innovation, in defense and the readiness to confront threats, military, ideological, or cyber, before they reach American soil. In this way, Pearl Harbor's legacy isn't frozen in time. It breathes in military briefings, in international summits, and in every debate over national security policy. The memorial and the ship below it serve as more than monuments. They are living reminders of the cost of unpreparedness and the power of unity in crisis. They challenge each new generation not just to remember, but to remain vigilant, and to understand that the defense of peace is a daily responsibility, not a historical footnote. On the morning of December 7, 1941, the world shifted on its axis. What began as a surprise attack turned into a defining moment that reshaped a nation's destiny. In just under 2 hours, isolation turned into action, uncertainty into resolve, and the United States into a central force in a global conflict. Pearl Harbor wasn't just the trigger for war, it was the crucible that forged America's modern identity. Now it's your turn to weigh in. Do you think the United States would have entered World War II without the attack on Pearl Harbor? Would the nation have stayed on the sidelines if not for that fateful morning? Drop your thoughts in the comments. I'd love to hear your take. And if you found this video insightful, don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit that notification bell for more deep dives into the turning points that shaped history. Check out the next video in the series, D-Day, the invasion that turned the tide, or Hiroshima, the day the world changed forever. Links are right here on screen and in the description below. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next chapter of history.